Welcome to Sober Dad Crew, the podcast where we talk about all things sobriety, recovery, parenting, music, tattoos, work, and more. For more information, please visit soberdadcrew.com. My guest this episode is social worker and chemical dependency counselor Merrit Hartblay. He's also the author of the book Lost Innocence and the host of the Recovery Road podcast. Merrit, welcome to Sober Dad Crew.
Hey, Steve, thanks you having me on. I've heard all good things about you from our good buddy Jason Mayo.
Yeah, I love Jason. Cool guy. What a great interview. And, I was thinking about him recently because he did this, career pivot into, addiction recovery stuff. And like, I admire the guts to do that, to accept like a pay cut to do good works. So,
well, I kind of, my story is kind of the same thing, and now I work as a social worker in an outpatient clinic, and I'm a therapist and stuff. And I realize that the work that I'm doing now, I've been sober 16 years. And, really, it's not about the money. For me, it's about helping people. I believe I'm very spiritual. So I believe that we do the work and it somehow comes back to us in other ways.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. So my wife's a social worker and a therapist also.
Oh, cool.
So
right, cool.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the genre of human being. I mean, she's badass, and she does hard work and trauma work, and it's such important stuff that she does.
Yeah, I mean it's been a very challenging job emotionally, but being sober, I've learned how to put self-care number one. So when I do group therapy or individual therapy, I make sure that I'm prepared ahead of time and stuff. Because if you don't find a way of like kind of putting a shield up between you and the patients, their shit can spill over onto you. So you have to kind of way to keep yourself clean.
I know. I come home and I complain about work, and I'm like, I should just shut up. My spreadsheet, like an interpersonal office dynamics is like.
But having a wife as a therapist, that's like free therapy, man.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's probably not a healthy relationship dynamic, but
yeah, it could be tricky. There could be boundaries there.
Yeah. Just, before we dig too far in, how many kids do you have?
I have one son. He'll be he just turned 32 this month, and I just had my second grandson born 3 weeks ago. So I have two grandchildren, and very grateful for that.
You might be my first grandpa on the show. So
it's crazy.
Cool.
I'm going to tell you that being sober, is a real gift. And my life was pretty much on fire before that. And 16 years later, when I was drinking and drugging, I gave up everything to have the drugs and the alcohol. And I put everybody else last. And when I got sober, I learned so much. And now it's I have all the things that I thought I lost, but so much more. Man, my son is my best friend, which is amazing.
Yeah. Amen. And, we'll sort of dig into your story, but, so he was 16 when you got
15?
sober?
Yeah, he was 15 when I got sober. I remember.
He remembers some shit.
Yeah, he remembers some stuff. And, it was a journey for the both of us. When he was 15 years old and I walked up into his room and I said, Trevor, you know what? Your dad's got a problem and with alcohol and drugs, and I need to move out of the house so that I can get better for me. And I did, and it was a tough thing to do. But at that point, me and his mom were kind of having a tough go of it. So our marriage was kind of like coming to an end. And and I walked out, and for a long time, he felt that he'd been abandoned. But one of the things I learned early in recovery, Steve, is about acceptance. And I learned that, I would send him a text every day and I'd say, hey, Trevor, I'm your dad. I love you. I'll always be there for you, and just let it go. It took about 6 months for us to reconnect. And 6 months later, I get a text one day from Trevor like, hey, Dad, what do you want to do tomorrow? And the next day was Father's Day, and we got back together. And it's been an amazing journey. We've grown. We've gone through a lot of stuff together, but, we got really close. And, yeah, he's like my best friend.
Yeah, and there's so much, to that. Before we get into it, can you kind of, whatever degree you're comfortable, kind of, what came before walking into his room,
Well, so before I walked into his room, I had been in the world of telecommunications and sales for a lifetime. I say I lived comfortably numb for 30 years. So
they like to drink in sales.
Yeah, well,
it's like Mad Men.
They like to drink in sales. It was like Mad Men. And, it got to the point where, there's a couple things that happened before that. I had worked for I worked for one of the largest telecom companies in the world, a company called WorldCom. And it was the biggest bankruptcy case in the history of America. So I was a division sales manager of the company, had 50,000 stock options ready to vest in 30 days. Strike price was, I think, 12. The stock was like in the 60s. And then overnight, the company went chapter 11, chapter 7, lost everything.
The giant flushing sound.
Yeah, it was bad. And I mean, if my drinking wasn't bad, it got pretty bad then. So, but you know what? I somehow, that's when I got sober. Well, no, that. It took me a while to get sober from then. I was trying to invent myself, and it was hard. It was hard. But so what happened was, I guess I was working for, before. You want to talk about when he was 15, you want to before that, or what do you want me, how do you want me to
kind of like whatever, kind of like how, really, how did it kick off? Some people are like, I was 12 and I had my first drink and hallelujah. I was the kind of person, like, I didn't really drink much until my 20s. And it was always like this medicinal, like it was the tool I used to like try and manage my mental health unsuccessfully.
Oh, clearly, I talk about it in my book. And, I went to college on a track scholarship to Binghamton. So, it was Harper College then. It was 1972. And, so I was a real, I guess you call it like a Wally Cleaver. I was a real jock and stuff. So I didn't have my first drink until maybe, it might have been, end of junior year college. That was the first time I drank, and drugs are pretty prevalent. I mean, people smoking pot all over the place. So my track coach kept me kind of sheltered, but it was around the senior year of college when things really took off. That's when I started drinking more and started smoking pot, and, things got crazy. I was all set to go to law school, and, I decided not to because all my friends that were lawyers, I just didn't like what the people they had become. And I wanted to get into broadcasting. I worked on the campus radio station for about 4 years in Binghamton. And then I worked at a radio station called WAAL. It was an FM station in Binghamton. So I wanted to get into broadcasting, but I figured I'll go home. I applied to a couple of grad schools. I figured I'll come back up to New York. And that's what I did. I came back home and pounded the pavement looking for a job in broadcasting, and went to every radio and TV station I could think of. And one day I walked into CBS. They have corporate headquarters on 52nd Street called Black Rock, and walked in there to HR. And, I said I was looking for a job in broadcasting. They said, you don't have any experience. So I said, well, what about sweeping the floors or something? I just wanted to get my foot in the door.
Yeah.
And I did. And I got a job working in corporate payroll. And that was my foot into the door and my beginning of my journey into corporate America. So, but you know how that was? This was 1976. I worked hard, but I was big into music, and, I was going to Studio 54 4 nights a week, and, people were partying hard and working, but there was no issue then. Nobody ever said to me, you have a problem. Steve, it was everybody was working, everybody was partying, and that's just the way it was. So I never really thought that I had a problem. It wasn't until 30 years later. I lived comfortably numb for 30 years, and then things kind of hit rock bottom.
Yeah, there's a point where the fun's not fun, and it's harder to have the fun, right? And it just is that slippery slope. I mean, there's so many variations of that story, that I've had on this show, and that people hear all the time. It's like nobody goes into this saying, I would like to be an alcoholic. That's like a fucking life goal for me. That is not what people do.
Well, both of my parents were big drinkers, and, me and my sister, we grew up in a household of that. So, I saw what it did. I didn't like what it did. I hated what alcohol was all about. I swore at like 13 years old I'd never drink. And, and sometimes you become what you said you'd never want to become, yeah. So, it's funny. I've gone back to a couple of close friends that I've had for over 50 years, and I've asked them, how come you never said anything to me? They said, well, because we were always having a good time with you. So I guess I could hold my liquor pretty well. I wasn't a fall down drunk. I wasn't a blackout drunk. I didn't, I could drink, but then when you start to incorporate the cocaine and other things, it gets a little bit blurry, and And I think it was towards the end, when the WorldCom situation blew apart. I think things started really falling apart for me then. You can juggle the balls only so long, right, Steve? Juggle the bills, juggle being a dad, juggle being a husband, and then all of a sudden the balls start falling and you can't pick them up again. And
Right.
that's
And
what
you
happened.
catch a couple of them and
Catch a
then they
couple.
all fall.
Then they all fall. So I was faced with that. This was, September, I guess. Well, yeah, September 24th, 2008. My sober date. I drove my son to high school in Port Washington here, and came back home. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning. I was already on my third or fourth drink. And I was like, I can't live like this anymore. I had people in recovery some people can identify with this. I had the worst feeling. I didn't want to live and I didn't want to die. I didn't want to live, but I didn't want to leave my son without a dad. So I think, I was brought up in the Jewish faith, but never very religious. But it was the first time in my life that I prayed. And I said, God, please help me, because I don't know what to do, And I think I think that's your way of surrendering and giving up. And when you do that, for me, things just fall into place. A dear friend of mine, Peter, who would mind mentioning his name, Peter's we're like friends from the crib. He's my attorney, my best friend. I called him up and I said, I got a problem, I need help. So he lived up in Mamaroneck, New York. I drove up to him. I hadn't taken care of myself in 6 months, hadn't showered, shaved. I was a complete mess. And I met with him for breakfast and I said, I have a problem. And he said, it's going to be okay. And, that was like a load off my shoulders.
Yeah.
I called my doctor up and I said, I need to come see you today. And I went to see him and I said, I have an alcohol problem. He goes, yeah, I know that. He says, every time you come to see me, you think that the chewing gum is going to cover up the alcohol pouring out of your skin. So I met with him.
But they don't say anything.
But why didn't they say anything? That's the crazy thing.
Yeah.
I wanted to say, well, if you knew all that time, but I guess I don't know where the responsibilities lie. I don't know where they say
or what your response would have been, but seems like maybe.
So I said to him, I said, I know I have a drug and alcohol problem, but my head's pretty effed up. I need a psychiatrist. So I went on at that time, my wife's medical insurance website and started calling all these psychiatrists, but they were like, I can see you in 30 days. I can see you next month. And I was like, I need to see somebody today, because I don't know if I'm going to make it through tomorrow. The last psychiatrist I called said, listen, I can't see you, but there's a program at North Shore Hospital in Manhasset. They have an outpatient program. Call them up. So I called them up, made an appointment, went in there and met with the psychiatrist and, put me on Celexa, some medications for, depression. And my first group was that night. It was like one flew of the cuckoo's nest, sitting in a circle of people. And I'm like, what the fuck I don't belong here. So I didn't go back. But the next day I went on my son's computer, and I don't know how this happened. I Googled AA. I saw a movie a long time ago called Clean and Sober with Michael Keaton. It's a great movie.
Yeah.
Great movie. So I Googled AA and I called the Nassau County Intergroup, and they said there's a meeting at Temple Judea at 11 o'clock. And I got to my car and I went there and I walked through the door of that meeting. And I feel like I was home for the first time, and that was it. September 24th, 2008 is my sober date, and never looked back. I dumped right into my recovery. I wasn't working at the time, so I was going to like 3 or 4 meetings a day, got a sponsor, started doing step work, and everything little by slowly started to change. Little by slowly started to change. And what happened was I was getting clean and sober. Trevor wasn't really talking to me at that time, so I was just focusing on my sobriety. And then I think it was this was September. So I think it was around October, September, January, something like that. An old buddy of mine called me up. He was VP of a company in the city. He goes, I need a sales manager. You want to come work? And I said, yeah, I need to get back to work. So I went to work for this company in the city. It was at One Penn Plaza, right at Penn Station. And sales manager, 2 sales teams. I love doing sales. I love being a sales manager, and quickly started getting successful. But you talked about it before, Steve. In the world of sales and alcohol go hand in hand. Entertaining clients, you go on sales trips. And I was bare knuckling it. I was having a hard time. But I found a meeting to go to. So every day at 12 o'clock when guys were going to lunch, I went to a meeting. But it got really bad, and I talked to my sponsor one day, and I prayed on it. And I went into my general manager, who knew that I was sober, that I was getting sober, and I said, you know what? I really, really appreciate everything you've done for me, but I can't do this job. I can't be around alcohol or any job that has to do with alcohol. So they worked it out for me that I could go on unemployment. They worked it out so I could go on unemployment, and I collected unemployment, and I just started trying to figure things out, praying on it, asking. I'm not religious, but spiritually asking God for guidance. I think once you kind of surrender and give up, the answers start to come. And I was going to meetings every day, and I was getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And then it's funny, my son, he was captain of the football team, and he came to me one day and he goes, "Dad, the guys on the team aren't taking alcohol and drugs seriously. Can you come into the school and talk to them?" And I was like, Trevor, I've been coaching Little League Baseball in that town for like 10 years. These kids all know me. If I go into the school and I start talking about my story and about drugs and alcohol, they might say some bad things about me. And he goes, "Dad, I don't really care. We need to do something." So I talked to the principal of the high school and some of the health teachers, and I started going into the school every couple of weeks and talking to all the health classes about alcohol and drugs. And Trevor came out of his class, sat right next to me, and all these kids, I knew all these kids, but so I started talking to them about alcohol and drugs and life. And these kids are like deers in the headlight, just watching, listening to me. And they started writing letters to the teacher. And Ms. Kalinowski, this health class teacher, sent me once a package of all the letters. And I started reading letters, and they were like heart-wrenching, "Mr. Hartblay, thank you for coming to talk to us. I've been drinking since I'm 10 years old. I don't know what to do. I think my dad's an alcoholic. I think my father's doing this and that." And so what happened, one good thing happened, one bad thing happened. The good thing, well, the letters, I was sharing the letters at a Step 12 meeting that I was running. And after the meeting, a mom came up to me after, and she goes, "You need to do something more." I don't know what to do. And I prayed on it. And then it came to me, you need to become a drug counselor so that you can help people. So back then, New York State had a program called VESID, Vocational Educational Services with Individuals with Disabilities. And they considered, New York State considers alcohol and drugs to be a disability. And they paid for schooling. I went back to school to get my CASAC. And but the bad side of that was that all these kids started going home and asking their parents questions. And I got shunned by the whole town because now the parents didn't want the kids coming home and questioning, "Dad, I think you drink too much. Mom, I think you're doing this." And so, but I said, "You know what? Screw it. I don't really give a shit. You know what? Fuck them. You know what? If I could help one person." I took a kid to an Alateen meeting, took a mom to an Al-Anon meeting, and I went back to school. I was going to school full time, Monday through Thursday, 8 hours a day to become a CASAC. And that was the beginning of my journey into becoming a counselor.
And when did the social work piece kick in?
So what happened was so I had to do my hours. It was like, 350 school hours. And then I had to do all my clinical hours. So I was working part-time at an outpatient facility in Mineola, Long Island, and at an outpatient where I am working now. And loving the work that I was doing. But then, I really wanted to work full time. And the lady who I work for now, Claudia, said, "Come work for me." So I started working full time. So I was working full time at an outpatient clinic, running groups, loved it. Did that for about 2 years. And then it was like, one day I said to myself, someday I want to do more. I want to do therapy, and I got to get a higher credential. Well, I was doing I'm an alumni athlete from Binghamton. So I spent a lot of time there, back and forth to the university, working with all different divisions. And somebody told me that they had an MSW program. And I was like, wow. So I called up, I was going up there for an alumni weekend meeting. I called up the dean of the school and I said, "I'm coming up. Can I talk with you?" And I went up there on a Friday. I met with the dean of the social work school. Turned out we grew up in the same area in Jamaica, Queens, was playing Jewish geography. And we're talking about this and about that. And I told her my story, and she goes, "Well, let me introduce you to the director of admissions." So she takes me down the hallway to the director of admissions, and I meet with him, and we're having a long chat, telling what my dream to do is. And he basically said, "Well, we're not taking," this is like around April. She says, "We're not taking any applications for the fall, but I would encourage you to apply anyway, but you really couldn't, you couldn't do this part time. You'd have to move up here, So, I said, "Okay." So he gave me the names of a couple of treatment centers in Binghamton, and I came back home and I sent out a bunch of resumes, filled out the application for the grad school. And, it's funny. when you surrender, to me, when you surrender to God and you give up and you say, I'm done, I can't do this anymore, and I'm looking for guidance, somehow you get the pieces come together. And I got a phone call about a week later from a treatment center in Binghamton. The executive director was looking for a counselor to start like in June. I mean, this was already like to start maybe a 4 weeks later. So I went up, I had the interview. I knew that at that point in time, I could probably get a job anywhere because of my experience. Went really well. On the way back home, I stopped at the grad school, saw the dean, said I applied for this job. She goes, good luck, keep me posted. And I went back home. And literally, I don't know, maybe it was like 5 or 6 days later, I get the offer letter from the treatment center. And the next day, I got accepted to grad school for the fall, for starting in August. So I'm like, this is great, but how am I going to pay for this? I could barely rub two nickels together. I had lost everything because of the WorldCom thing. So my son was just in his sophomore year at Binghamton. And he goes, Dad, just fill out FAFSA, get a state loan, get a loan. And I did. And I went up to Binghamton on a couple of weekends. I found a place to live close by to campus, packed up all my shit and moved to Binghamton. And I was in the grad, so I was working 40 hours a week during the day at an outpatient clinic, going to school 2 nights a week, doing 15 hours of field work for 3.5 years. For 3.5 years, I did that. Graduated with almost a 4.0. And that was my entree because I wanted to get the social work piece because having the chemical dependency piece is really huge. But I wanted the social work piece to learn about theory. So now when I see a patient, I can apply so many different things because, it's not one shoe fits all, it's very eclectic. So that's how I got into the social work piece.
Yeah. Yeah. As I said before we started, and people who listen to this know, my wife, she's got her doctor of social work and is, a therapist and teaches in some master's programs. So,
cool.
We're team social work
Right.
in this house. And
that's cool.
Yeah. So back to that sort of speaking in school, I think it's like why I'm public, it's so important.
Well,
and
it's
back
funny.
then, I mean, it's a lot more common, right? Like I was joking with somebody who was on here, and she's like, I'm sort of like that sober professional guy. That's how like some people think of me in Ithaca, who's that guy? Oh, it's Steven who worked at the architecture firm. He's like that sober professional guy. But I'm not the only one, right? Like there was that time when it was like you weren't supposed to say anything.
Right.
It was like all like hush, hush, that's the origin of I'm going to a meeting, right?
Well,
I got a meeting.
Well, I can talk about that. I can talk about that at length. I mean, so yes, I believe it's really important. If you want to fast forward to what I'm doing now, I got really involved with. I worked for when I came back to New York. I worked for a mental health agency for about 14 months. I wanted to learn more about mental health, so I was dealing with patients that were all diagnosed with severely mental health issues and also smoking crack or pot or whatever. And I dove into that whole world of mental health, all the different psych hospitals, working with psych doctors. And I saw a lot of shit that was going on. A lot of people were falling through the cracks. And I was doing that. And so mental health has been a big thing, that I've been really working closely with. What happened was, so when I was in Binghamton, I guess I was writing a paper in the library one day and something came over me saying, you got to do more. You got to do more. And that's when I decided to write the book. It took me about 4 years really to finish the book. And I believe that I had an obligation to write my story to let people know that even when everything is burned to the ground, you can still rise from the ashes and you can reinvent yourself, And so I wrote the book. And then when I finished the book, I sent it out to all these publishing houses, and they would come back. We love your manuscript. We'd love to publish your book. We have this program. If you spend like $5,000, I'm like, I'm not spending any money. You should pay me to write the book. I wrote the book. You should pay me. So I started a GoFundMe account and I raised about $800-900. And then one of my cousins says, Merritt, you have a second cousin down in Philadelphia, Jess, and she's a 2-time best-selling author. She has her own YouTube channel. Call her up. And I called up Jess. We hadn't spoken in maybe 25 years. And I said, this is what's going on, blah, 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 blah. She says, well, email me the manuscript. She calls me back the next day. She goes, okay, let's do it. And she self-published the whole thing. I mean, she's amazing. She did the whole thing, all the editing, everything, layout, design, boom. So the book, we and I did a lot of pre-marketing ahead of time, which she taught me all about. So doing social media marketing on YouTube, on all over the place, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and then we had the book come out on my birthday, August 14th, 2020. So the book was out, and and then the podcast came out of that. But to go back to this thing about, so as all this is happening, and I'm working it, and then I wound up coming back to the outpatient facility where I worked before I went to Binghamton. I've been there now back about 6 years. And this whole thing about, everybody who's drug addicted, everybody has a substance abuse problem. 9 times out of 10, there's a mental health piece to it, and as bad as the drug abuse problem is in this country, mental health is worse. So I decided that I have to do more. I really wanted to get involved. What happened was when the podcast first, so the book came out, and then about 6 months later, I said to Jess, I got to do more. And so we designed the podcast, Recovery Road. And so the podcast came out, and it was all about people in recovery and issues and topics around recovery. But then if you remember, I'm sure you're familiar with this whole fentanyl crisis. So the fentanyl crisis hit, and I was involved in opioid addiction for a long time, working with patients and stuff. So the podcast came out, and then I got introduced to 2 moms who had lost their children to fentanyl murder, and these 2 moms came on my podcast and told their stories, which were heart-wrenching. This one mom, Amanda Faith, her son Luca was like 12 years old. It was during COVID. Kids weren't in school. He was at home on Snapchat, bought a pill. Parents came home. He was dead. So I went on my podcast to say that for the next year or so, I'm going to dedicate my podcast for families who have lost ones to fentanyl. And we didn't call it, this wasn't like an overdose. This was murder. This was strictly murder, that people were taking pills. They didn't think they were going to die. And they came on. So I went on social media. I said, for the next year, I'm going to dedicate my podcast. And oh my God, by the next day, Steve, I must have been contacted by 60 families from across the country. You want to come on your podcast. So if you go back into the early days of my podcast, now we're about 3 years now into it, all these families started coming. And I got very involved in the movement. There was a group called Appalled, Association of Parents Against Lethal Drugs. We had our first rally in Washington, D.C. about 3 years ago. I spoke. We had it right outside the Chinese embassy. So I got head over heels into this whole thing. And I got more and more, more and more, we got to do more. I got to do more. And this whole mental health piece became clear to me that we have to get education into the schools, like at the elementary school level. So about 5 or 6 months ago, one of the dads that I work with said, there's this girl you got to meet. Her name is Gracie Parker. When she was 6 months old, her mom died of drug addiction. Her father was out of the picture because of drugs, and her grandparents brought her up. And she started this website called whyuskids.org. And she realized that when she was in elementary school that the kids that she was talking to all had trauma, but there was nobody qualified to help them. So she created this website called whyuskids.org, and she started talking at events all over the place to bring awareness to mental health. So I had her on the podcast with her and her grandmother, and we were in touch on a regular basis. And I said, you know what? Shoot, I got to do something. So I put together a whole syllabus, a whole curriculum for mental health for like schools, like kindergarten to 6th grade. And over the last several months, I've met with a couple of state senators and a couple of school district people. And now I'm trying to bring mental health awareness and education into the schools, because I think that if we can educate kids at a very early age about substance abuse and mental health and how to deal with it and how to recognize the signs, I think we could change the pendulum and have less people that wind up with addiction.
Yeah, I mean, we're such an open house because we're a sober house, and we're really,
that's great.
Open about that and don't hide it. And I, like wear my sober dad crew gear out, and I think
I need to get some of that swag. I need to get some sober dad stuff. That'd be great.
I'll print you something. We'll talk about that.
Yeah, that's cool.
the young kids, because they see what they see at home, and they're still, really inundated in media around alcohol, and other drugs. And to your point, there's I think it was the Washington Post did a piece in a family similar to what you said. Their kid thought he was buying, I don't know what, some pill, Facebook.
Yeah.
And it was a fake pill, it's fentanyl, and the thing, they came home and he was dead. And there isn't enough like conversation around that at all.
No.
Because people also, they look and see what they see on the streets.
Right.
And that's what they think is an addict. They don't think that anyone can be at risk, right? Because they see people who are unhoused and all that, and they're like, oh, that's what addiction looks like. I'm like, no, like it looks like all these people I talk to who are like all professionals.
Check this out. I had on my podcast about 3 weeks ago, Mary Beth O'Connor. She wrote a book, from shooting meth at 17 to becoming a federal judge. So, and I've been doing this for a long time. I've had airplane pilots, doctors, nurses. People think that, the addict is a guy with a raincoat sitting underneath the bridge with a bag of, a brown paper bag with alcohol in it. Right. That's not who it is. That's not who it is at all. So, I think that, there's a couple of things that, society, it's still the big elephant in the room. Now, I can tell you, in regards to the whole fentanyl crisis, there's some big things happening. The Sacklers, if you're familiar with Dope Sick and the whole thing, there's a big ruling that just came down now. A lot of money is going to be paid back out to families. So there's a lot of people that have been advocating for a long time. Ed Bish is one of the dads that I work with, and there's a big ruling coming down. We're going to try to be in court in Nassau County. So there's been a lot of, I think there's more and more talk. But here's the thing. I don't like to get into politics, Steve, but China is producing all the fentanyl in the factories. They get into bed with the Mexican cartels to bring it across into our country, and everybody looks the other way because it's all about the money, right? So I'm not getting into politics, but I'm thinking that maybe this new administration might try to do something to shut this thing down. Because, here's the thing, though. You're never going to stop the flow of drugs, Steve, but I think if you can create the education piece, make children aware at a very early age about the dangers of this, that just maybe they won't buy the product. Maybe they won't buy the product as much as doing now.
Well, and I think the other side of that, and to sort of stay out of politics, which I'm not always good at, and we might not agree on the current administration, but that's all good. We can always disagree. Is okay. Also our mental health, like the base mental health services, are really bad, right? How long does it take anyone to get a therapist? So
forget it.
Those are, my concerns at what I'm seeing right now coming out is like SNAP benefits getting cut, and basic things, and health insurance being unaffordable, and all these things. And, I live in a pretty rural area now, and we have very few, community doctors. So I worry that the baseline defense and helping people with mental health is really, really, it was never good, but it's even like more at risk now.
Well, the biggest fight that I fight every day is with insurance companies. I believe that nobody in this country should have to pay for mental health and substance abuse treatment. It should not have to pay for it. It should be the government pays for it. Claudia Ragney, the executive director that I work with that owns Kenneth Peters Center for Recovery, she's involved with a bunch of people. They're going up to Albany. They're trying to get some legislation passed where you pay just $500 for 60 visits, and it covers all of your. But you're right, though. I can tell you over the years how many people I know that got lost because we couldn't get them covered for insurance, And here's the thing. If somebody's asking for help, the window is so small to get them help. If you don't get them help in that window, you might lose them. You might lose them.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue we shouldn't pay for any health insurance, right?
We shouldn't.
We're the only sort of Western nation that has, and I listen to a lot of business podcasts too, right? So our insurance model where it's linked to your job is very wacky, right? Like it's actually not a good business practice. It's really expensive for employers.
Yeah.
I would argue that there's brilliant entrepreneurs out there who aren't going to go try their idea because they need to make sure they have health insurance for their family.
I
So
know.
we're the only Western nation that has this weird for-profit employer-based health system. And then we carve up the body because I've got health insurance. Well, okay, that's everything that's not my brain, mental health side of my brain, my eyes, and my teeth.
Right.
Somehow, those things are separate parts of my body with separate insurances. It's just nuts. And, talking to my wife about who's paneled on a lot of
Right.
insurances, including the public ones in New York,
Right.
which a lot of people won't panel on because they're a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
But those are also people who really often have the most need. It is just nutty to me that, and to me, it's like, why is health politics? You know what I mean? Like,
Shouldn't be.
we can disagree with a lot of issues on immigration or whatever, but I'm like, okay, we're talking about people's health, right?
Yes.
Like, it seems like a very baseline thing,
Well,
and a pro-capitalist thing to actually remove this financial burden from businesses.
yeah.
They'll make more money. I know the place I work puts into the insurance. It's really a lot, and it's still this high deductible insurance.
I know. And what's even a bigger issue too is that I do a lot of work with veterans.
Yeah, high risk population.
And the VAs that I work with are a joke. At least the ones that I've been with, they don't do anything. They shoot these guys up with more drugs and just send them on their way. I mean, they got to do trauma work. You get these guys, the Army spends millions of dollars to make them killing machines. They come back home and they get kicked to the curb like, have a nice day. I mean, how is that possible? I mean, they should be given housing for the rest of their lives. If our senators and people can get salaries for the rest of their lives, then why shouldn't these soldiers that come home be given housing for the rest of their lives?
Senators have some good health insurance too,
well,
courtesy of us.
I mean, I got to tell you something. Working in the field that I work in, and you're aware of this. We don't make a lot of money. I've got guys in my group that are garbage men that are making, $80,000, $90,000 a year. I'm not making that, but I don't do it for the money. But thank God I'm working full time and I'm collecting Social Security. If I wasn't collecting Social Security, I couldn't do my full time job. I wouldn't be making enough. It's like, it's hard. I'm trying to save people's lives every day, but it's like, it gets tough. Sometimes it gets tough, but you just have to like I say, if you do the work, somehow I believe that somehow the bills get paid, somehow the car gets fixed, somehow, things work out.
Well, my wife always talks about you do the right thing and then you find the next right thing and you do that.
Right.
And then it's like one day at a time, right? It's a version of that.
It is.
You go, and I always say to people, where do you want to be in 5 years? If they're like, oh, okay, where do you want to be in a year? Now let's talk about how you're going to get there. Right. And there's a cool new program in Ithaca, Service and Unity, and they help post-incarcerated.
Oh, great. I love the reentry.
And recovery people get jobs. And so, where I work, we hired someone out of that, and he's like 1 day a week. They will let somebody do 2 hours a month. They'll find something for them if that's what they can handle, because people like to work.
Yeah.
They take pride in their work. So they meet them where they are. They find a match, and then it builds up, and they build their resume. They get some money. The money, and the company's working with the organization, right? Yeah. So the person is actually an employee of Service and Unity who contracts with whatever company. Right. It's a great, great program. And it's really, that could be duplicated everywhere.
Oh, I know. When I was in Broome County, I worked with the felon reentry program, and John Jay College here in the city hires felons. Everybody deserves, it's funny when I go to jails and prisons to talk to people. I mean, this country spends millions and millions of dollars incarcerating people that should be in treatment, not locked up with killers. And
amen, brother. Amen. I long ago was a reading tutor in prison, and I was like right out of college, which was not yesterday.
Yeah.
And Ernest, changed the world. And I was like, oh, so many of them can't read.
No, it's
And
crazy.
so many of them are there for drugs and alcohol. And then so many of them were people of color
Yeah.
because they are incarcerated at a much higher percentage than their population is represented in this
Oh,
country,
of course. Of
and
course.
criminalized.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I thought, wow, this is like what privilege is for me, having grown up middle class and white in
Yeah.
America.
Yeah. I didn't learn about white privilege until I went to grad school. That's when I learned about white privilege and stuff. But I just thought about something you mentioned earlier. I want to go back to before I lose my thought. You talked about, when Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob started AA in 1935, it was all about anonymity. It's about keeping it private, just first names only. And I think that was great, for a long, long time. But in the last couple of years, I've kind of been on a different kind of a bandwagon to help break the stigma, because we have to break the stigma. There's a really good movie out there called The Anonymous People, and basically the message is that if we don't tell people that recovery works, how are people going to know? Like, if the gay people hadn't spoken up about AIDS, you never would have had all the AIDS research. If women with breast cancer hadn't spoken up, you wouldn't have the Susan B. Komen Foundation. So I believe that people that have good, long recovery, I believe, have an obligation to let people know that it works. So now if I go to a meeting, instead of saying my name is Merritt, I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic, my name is Merritt, I'm a person in long-term recovery, which means I haven't had a drink or a drug since September 24th. So I think we need to help break the stigma, because, Steve, the stigma is bad. It's, as much as we try to break it, it's a bad stigma.
Yeah, I remember I'll be 15 years early next month. And I
Nice.
remember being in
Congratulations.
a job interview process, and I hadn't been that public. And I was like, you know what? It's time to be public. And I put something on LinkedIn. And it was right in this interview process. I think I had one interview, and I was getting ready for the other one. And then I guess we weren't married yet, but I said to my now wife, I was like, oh my God, like, what did I do? I might not get this job. And then I was like, if I don't get this job for
Because
that,
of that, you don't want it.
screw it.
Right. You don't want it.
I don't want to work with those people.
Exactly. Exactly.
And, this year at our holiday party, we had a delicious mocktail. I don't judge other people, like, do
No.
your thing. But, I was like, can we just have something for other people? And I'm sitting there and I'm looking around the room. And what are we, 30, probably almost 70 people with spouses and partners and all that. And I'm looking around, I'm like, there's a lot of people drinking mocktails.
Well, you know what? I think when I was drinking, I think when you're an alcoholic, you think everybody's drinking as much as you are. But then when I stopped drinking, I realized not that many people were drinking as much as I thought they were.
Yeah. You just couldn't remember.
Couldn't remember, because
Right.
it was all about me.
So it's changing. It's changing with young people. Like, my oldest is 21.
Yeah.
And we have, staff in their 20s at work, and they are not really interested in alcohol.
No, I think that
I think the world of weed is sort of a different thing in a bigger conversation. And
yeah, we could have a whole other conversation
yeah,
about that. I mean, we could have a whole other conversation about that.
But, on the alcohol front, there's like less interest.
I think
And,
so.
I was never like a beer guy, so I'm not interested in the NA beers. But, like, I've had lots of people on this show that are like, that it was part of their recovery.
Yeah, but
right?
I've had a lot of people relapse because they thought they could drink non-alcoholic beer. But, why would you want to do that? Because eventually the brain, it's like, I want the real thing. I'm drinking it, but I'm not getting the buzz.
Yeah. Know thyself. I think you have to know and do the work. That's the work, right?
Yeah.
That's the therapy or the group work,
right,
to understand if that is or isn't a trigger for you.
Right.
Because for some people, they're like, absolutely can have, like, I've had somebody tell me, they're like, oh, I can have NA this, but I cannot have an NA tequila because tequila was my devil.
Yeah, they've got like zero proof alcohol. They've got zero alcohols now. It's crazy. Why would you want to do that? I don't know.
I think, like I said, you got to know yourself if you feel like you can do it. Or some people, sobriety does take a lot of different forms, right? Not everybody who's sober is actually an alcoholic, right? There are people who just have never had a drink, and I've had them on, right? It's a different story, but their reason, they have, and their reasons for doing it. Maybe they were an athlete, or maybe they grew up around a lot of drinking. and they were like, I am not going down that road. And they don't.
Well, you know what it is? I think that, I have to teach people too when they come into outpatient. There's a big difference between sobriety and abstinence. You might not drink or do drugs, but if your behaviors haven't changed, then you're
The
not really
dry
sober.
drunk.
But if somebody tells you they're sober, that means that their life has changed. They're honest. They love who they are. They're self-confident. They're not in any codependent relationships. Things kind of like that.
Yeah, and I think it's about, like, I didn't do a program, but I did a lot of therapy.
Good.
And I think 12-step works great for some people.
It's not for everybody.
I think you just have to find your way,
It's
and
not
we
for
need to make
everybody.
sure everybody finds their way, because you don't want them turned off by one thing. I mean, one guy I just interviewed was talking about refuge recovery, which is like Buddhism based, right? Because he was like, I struggled with the God thing.
Yeah, there's recovery dharma. There's a bunch. I tell patients that, when they come into I run an intensive outpatient group. So it's 3 hours a day, 3 days a week. And I tell them that for as long as you're in my phase of treatment, you have to have some type of support network. It could be AA, NA, CA, refuge recovery, dharma recovery, something, because because I tell them, what does your plan look like? When you're not here 3 hours a day, with the other 20 hours a day, if it's 8 o'clock at night and you're getting cravings, what are you doing? Who are you calling? You got to have some kind of support group in place, right? So, but there's no cookie cutter approach to recovery. When I do a treatment plan with somebody, it's very, very catered to them, to what we can do to help them stay clean and sober.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's more prevalent now too, right? There just are more options for people, and I think that's just really important, because there is no one size fits all thing. I wanted to circle back a little bit to, you rebuilding with your son, because I think that is a thing that's real. And you exercised a lot of constancy and patience in that. And, can you just talk a little bit more? I mean, you kind of just touched on it, but really how you rebuilt, because you could have gone out for Father's Day and it could have just fallen to pieces. So really, how did you rebuild that?
Rigorous honesty. Rigorous honesty. Basically, I think he's learned a lot from my experience, but I just told him the truth that, that I had been battling, drugs and alcohol for a long time, trying to get through life. And I was living a lie. I was living a life that people wanted me to be, and then so who I wanted to be. And it didn't happen all at once. I mean, this was it took a long time for us to rebuild our relationship, because even in sobriety, I made a couple of poor judgments in regards to, I shifted my addiction from drugs and alcohol to relationships, and I got into some relationships that I should have had no business getting involved in. So
very common.
Yeah. And in that case, I had to work on that. And, something really, I got involved with this lady I should never have gotten involved with. Right. And then I realized it was codependency. I was reading Melody Beattie books. I was teaching Melody Beattie stuff and, about the language of letting go and codependency. And I realized I shouldn't have been in this relationship. But she got very, very evil, to the point where she went to my son's house with at that time, not my ex-wife yet. And she banged on the door and told them everything about my relationship with her. So my son was really traumatized by that, so it took time for me to really explain to him what had happened. I think the good thing, Steve, was that being in grad school and him being in Binghamton at the same time there, we got a chance to really mend our relationship. We're big baseball fans. We're big Mets fans. Binghamton has, they had the AA team there. So we were going to baseball games. We're going to hockey games. We spent time together, and it took time. Here's the thing. Saying you're sorry doesn't mean shit to somebody in your family who's dealt with all that. Actions speak louder than words. So I had to show him over time that I was doing my best to become the person I was always meant to be, to become the true version of myself. And we just slowly over time started to bond, and we spent time together. And, I remember him coming to me when he was in his junior year, and he wanted to change majors from accounting to psychology because he saw the work that I was doing and he liked working with people. And he came to me and he said, What should I do? And I said, well, make an appointment with the chairman of the psychology department and talk to him and see what's required to switch at this point in your career. And he did. And they said, you have two choices. You can either take winter classes and summer classes or take an extra 6 months. So I said, Trevor, there's no race. There's no finish line. So he took an extra 6 months and he spent time and he enjoyed it. And then as time went on, it just somehow morphed into this special. In fact, me and my ex-wife, we became really good friends. I think sometimes you're meant to be friends instead of husbands and wives. And so the relationship became really good with Trevor and I. And, it's to the point now where he has, it took time. Like I said, it took rigorous honesty. If I'm going to be honest and I'm doing a 4-step and I'm opening up my life, I need to do that to Trevor in a way that he would understand as he got older. And then as he got older, and then I finally got sober, things really started getting better. So it was tumultuous there for a while, but I think I just gave him his space. Acceptance is a really big thing. Page 417, the big book about acceptance. Like I learned that I couldn't change him. I couldn't say anything like, I'm your dad. You got to do this, you got to do this. I had to let it go. And in his time, see what happens. Just let him know that I'm your dad. So I would send him a text every day. Trevor, I'm your dad. I love you. I'll always be there for you. Just let it go. Until that 6 months later, when we got together, I knew we had a long way to go, but I would meet him wherever I could and I would take whatever I could get. And it took time. And now, he's come to all my anniversaries. He has 16 coins. He comes to all my anniversary meetings. I give him I give him all of my coins, and he's been there. He talked at one of my anniversaries, and we've shared so many special times together over these years. Especially as baseball fans, and just going to things together, and then having his first son, and now having his second son, and being a grandfather. All these things. I mean, I thought I was going to be dead. Before I got sober, I didn't think I was going to make it, so now 16 years later, I feel like I have so much that I want to do, so much that I want to accomplish, and he's been there. I mean, I've run 6 New York City marathons. Self-care is really important to me. I have, clearly, I think I'm in really good shape. I mean, I have friends that look at me and they can say, how old do you think I am? And they'll say, I don't know, maybe like late 50s, early 60s. And I say, well, I don't know. I turned 70 in August and I feel great. I mean, I have a lot of people that I know in their 70s and they just look older because they haven't taken care of themselves. That's one of the gifts of sobriety, Steve, is that,
it's the vanity PSA.
Oh my God.
Right?
If alcohol and drugs didn't kill me, then I need to take care of myself more, self-care. So I go to the doctor, I do my blood work, I take care of myself, I eat well, I mean, you take away the alcohol and the drugs, here's the thing. My parents were both alcoholics, but you don't have to be a prisoner of your parents' genes. Everybody has addictive genes inside. And the question is, do you do something to activate it? Just like cancer cells, we all have cancer cells. Do you do something to activate them? So it's about, learning. Like I said, I have two goals for all the patients that I work with: to become the best version of themselves and become the person they were always meant to be. And I'm still evolving into that. With sobriety, you get a chance to evolve, so many times. And I'm just like, it's each day, Steve, I'm grateful to do and to pass on the message. That's why now for me, I call myself like the Johnny Appleseed of recovery, trying to just plant those seeds to help people find peace of mind.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful message to end on. Thank you so much for coming on.
No, I appreciate it very much.
Thanks for listening. Sober Dad Crew is a DIY project by Stephen Kimball, who writes, edits, and produces the show. To support the show, please review it where you listen to podcasts or visit soberdadcrew.com to buy some merchandise or make a donation.